Welcome back to another episode of The Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst, and today's guest is Sadie Sutton. Sadie is a 19-year-old college sophomore from the Bay Area, and after receiving a year and a half of intensive treatment for severe depression and anxiety, she was inspired to share her story with fellow teens going through their own personal growth. She started a podcast back in 2019 and has accumulated over 105 episodes, reaching over 75,000 listeners. Sadie conducts impactful and inspirational interviews with subject matter experts, fellow teenagers, and social media personalities to break down the stigma surrounding mental health and inspire teens to create their life worth living. Sadie is a psychology major at the University of Pennsylvania and hopes to pursue a career in clinical psychology to further her impact in the mental health field. So let's get this conversation going and welcome Sadie Sutton to the Adversity Advantage podcast. Sadie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
The feeling is mutual. I mean, I've had the good fortune of being on your podcast, and I got to say I'm super impressed, not only by how much effort and expertise you kind of put into things when it comes to your own podcast, but you're only 19 years old, and you're a leader in the teenage mental health space and trying to educate parents, trying to educate your peers on the importance of mental health awareness and also sharing your own story within that. And I think a good place for us to start is your own backstory, because I know you've had tons of mental health problems or tons of issues with your own mental health, and you've really come out on the other side and are doing a lot of good. So let's take it back to when you were a kid. Like, what was childhood like? What was your family dynamic like? What was your relationships with your parents and stuff like that?
Yeah, so for the most part, I had a pretty good childhood. I had two parents that were consistently in my life. My mom stayed at home with us, and so she was always there. I'm the oldest of four, so things were always very busy, very chaotic, lots going on. And it was pretty stable. We did move around a little bit, and we traveled a lot. But I always felt very supported, very consistent with having my parents there to support me when I was going through anything. But I do remember lots of little arguments and bickering between my siblings and I. But once I started school, I do remember being very aware and conscious of myself, of my environment, of other people, and that was little things, whether it was body image. I remember being aware of how I looked compared to other people as young as second grade. I remember being conscious about how myself or my family was being perceived or judged potentially by peers, which I don't think are things that most kids in second and third grade are really thinking about. But I was always very emotional. I felt my emotions very intensely, so I was very aware of how people responded to things, what I thought about things. And I do remember not always loving to have intense conversations with my parents, especially when it was something that I really cared about. If my parents were oh, how are things going with school, or how are things going with a friend, I would talk about it somewhat, but I never really felt the first person I wanted to go to and dive into all of these details with was my parents. And so there never was that direct primary line of communication. Getting into middle school, I had a good group of friends, a lot more of middle school drama as girls do, but I did really start to have best friend relationships cement and started dating here and there and having those romantic relationships. And I remember I would go about my relationships as normal, whether that was my family relationships, my friendships. It was really more outside of that I noticed things started to shift, whether it was how tired I was or how I wanted to spend my time. When I would come home from the school, rather than go to sleep and go to bed, it was I just want to keep working on this homework assignment for a really long time to distract myself. There was a lot of distraction and throwing myself into relationships instead of sitting with myself or with my thoughts or being more independent. I remember being very confused about what I wanted to do or what I was really passionate about. I tried a lot of different things, whether that was sports or activities, and looking back, I can kind of pinpoint why my depression got to the point that it did. And a big part of that was the belief systems that I was holding. And those really formed in middle school. And I became really depressed around 8th grade was when I was hospitalized for depression. And so the belief systems that I can pinpoint now, which I had no awareness of, was that I didn't think I was deserving of love. I didn't think I was going to be good enough for my parents no matter what I did. And I didn't think that I was capable of being happy. And eventually, as I began my mental health journey, that meant that I wasn't capable of recovery or getting help or getting support or things changing. So those belief systems meant that even as I was navigating these relationships, I didn't really feel that they were like fully authentic or that I was deserving of them or that they would make me truly happy because I wasn't deserving of that care and love and support. And then with my parents, it meant that I never wanted to share if I didn't feel okay or if something wasn't normal because it felt uncomfortable. Vulnerability is always something that doesn't feel great initially. And it was also that I didn't want to seem like even less good to them when I just wanted their love and support.
Let me pause really quick. And I love what you're sharing right now. And I think a lot of it is going to be very valuable, not just for parents that are listening to this, but kids, because this is all, like, you hear these stories a lot. My question is, you talked about these beliefs that you formed around not being loved or feeling kind of disconnected a little bit from your parents and that sort of thing, as far as like being able to share certain things, I guess. Like, where did all of this come from? Because I know when you started the conversation, you were saying that you did feel supported by your parents. You had a pretty good childhood. Like, where did these belief systems, like, if you could pinpoint a few things that contributed to these negative beliefs, like, what were they?
Yeah, I mean, this was something I struggled with a lot when I first got that depression diagnosis. And then again, with being like, I don't deserve to be happy, because there wasn't a reason that I was depressed. There wasn't a significant change in my life. I had parents that loved and cared and wanted to support me. They had the best of intentions. I didn't have any trauma that I experienced. There was no reason. I think it goes back to the emotion thing. I'm someone that feels my emotions very strongly. I also don't, like, my instinct isn't to be vulnerable and open and share things. And so if I feel my emotions so strongly, validation is something that's very important. And then if I'm not comfortable voicing that all the time, getting that validation, getting that support that we all need is more difficult. And so I think it was something that I internalized over time, that I felt these really strong emotions. They weren't necessarily seen as valid, most likely because I wasn't voicing them or expressing them or advocating effectively. And then that translated to a belief about my worthiness. But there really wasn't like a single reason that the mood started to shift. It was really just over time, struggling with my self-esteem, struggling with feeling seen and heard, and then developing these belief systems that really didn't have a lot of evidence to support them, but I was going through the world, navigating my relationships in a way that I was looking for those beliefs to be supported. So with my relationships with my parents, if we had an argument and they were like, no, that's not true, or you can't do this thing, I would internalize that as like, I can't do that thing because I don't deserve it, or because they don't understand my perspective. They're saying I'm not right. And so when you're looking through your world in a way that you're trying to find evidence for why you're not good enough, why you're not lovable, why you're not ever going to be happy, things become pretty grim pretty quickly. And that's exactly what happened to me. And so my mom started to notice that behaviorally things were kind of off. I remember I would get in the car every day after school and she'd be like, how are you? And I would say fine. And then I would turn towards the window and ignore her all the way home. And I would come home from school. I would work on school projects really late. I wasn't really sleeping. I was isolating a lot more, both from my family, spending a lot of time in my room, and then also from my friends. I started to pull back from that group of friends that were a good resource for me in the years prior. And so there was a shift in that aspect. I was someone that when I first started struggling, I really did pretty well to function pretty effectively. Like my academics didn't suffer. I was still showing up to things. Later on, I did struggle with those, but initially it wasn't like I just got out of bed and got into bed and couldn't get out. I continued to try and show up and distract myself from what I was feeling rather than looking inwards at all. And so I went to my pediatrician in the fall of my 8th grade year, and he listed out all of these typical depression symptoms. So whether that's like low mood or loss of interest, or sleeping more or less than you used to, feeling isolated. I don't remember all of them, but it's about 30 questions. And it was the first time anyone had ever listed everything I was experiencing, all these weird symptoms that I hadn't necessarily thought were abnormal because they'd started in such a gradual way. And I was also young enough, I was 13 at the time, that I didn't have friends that had experienced this. I feel like even in the past 4 or 5 years, there's been a shift with that, with media like 13 Reasons Why, and Euphoria, and mental health is being portrayed a lot more. People are talking about it more than ever, but I really don't remember having that awareness. I think I also had blinders on to what I was experiencing and wasn't really aware of what was going on with everyone else because I was just so overwhelmed with the emotions I was experiencing. But the pediatrician read out these symptoms of depression, and I remember crying because it was the first time that anyone had identified exactly what I was experiencing, and there was a name for it, or even just a list to explain these things. And because I had already always struggled with voicing what I was experiencing, that vulnerability and those emotions, it was something that I wasn't able to verbalize, and I didn't have the words to explain how I was feeling. Depression is something that's very abstract, and a lot of the times it's like you get it or you haven't had it before, you don't get it. It's very hard to explain. And I think we're getting better at kind of verbalizing it, but it's also very difficult to explain mental health challenges in a way that people can understand when they haven't experienced them themselves. So after that, I went to a psychiatrist appointment directly after my mom had scheduled that, and things were just like progressing pretty quickly. Like I was just so overwhelmed, so exhausted with what I was experiencing, so numb to what was going on, and I wasn't talking to anyone. So my parents, my friends, there was no line of communication between me and anyone else for what I was experiencing relating to my mental health. So that was something that was a pretty big issue because I didn't realize how depressed I was or what those thoughts, how those were translating, how I was coping with that. And so when I went to the psychiatrist appointment and she was like, "Can you tell me how you're feeling?" And I just shut down. I didn't say anything for the whole appointment. At one point, she had me draw a pie chart of my feelings, and I was like, I'm feeling sad. And there was no communication there. There was no ability to advocate for what I needed or explain what was going on or ask for help or verbalize that I needed a coping skill or I wanted to feel differently or this doesn't feel right. None of those things were happening. And so I had my first hospital stay right after that. I was in the hospital for 7 or 10 days.
So really quick, so what was going on at that moment? Like you say, you went to the hospital, and when you go, I mean, it's not something that's just, I mean, it's not something that's like a light thing, right? It's things are getting pretty bad if you're staying in the hospital for a period of time. So what was going on? What was your day-to-day like? What were your actions like? How were you feeling? What was going on?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I was having a conversation about this with my therapist last week or the week before about how quick clinicians are to hospitalize people in California. It's called a 5150. And it can be really uncommon in other states, but in California, any kind of mental health challenges, if anyone's seen as a harm to themselves or someone else, or even potentially, that people are quick to hospitalize individuals. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a good or bad thing. Hospitals can be a really effective tool. So in addition to being very numb and closed off, I do remember one way that I tried to express and explain what I was feeling was self-harm. So I struggled with cutting, and I remember kind of exploring, in a sense, when I was younger, different ways to hurt myself or be injured for attention, which is a kind of really terrible thing, but I wanted to be seen. There was something where I wasn't feeling seen or heard. So when I was 8 or 9, I was trying to break my arm with my desk. Didn't work. I'm not very good with pain. Was not a successful endeavor. But there was some desire to be seen and have that attention and have that focus be on me and what I was experiencing. And so as I started to become more depressed during the fall of my 8th grade year, one way that was expressed was through cutting. And I don't know exactly how to explain this, but people cut in different ways. Some people do it as a self-soothing method. It's very effective for them to channel their pain into one thing, or if they're feeling very numb with their emotions, they are able to feel something and have that shift. For me, it was all about validation. It was all about a way for people to understand that I was in pain, and this pain was measurable and it wasn't just internal. And it also caused quite a lot of chaos in my family, and it was a way for my parents to, for me to know that my parents cared and were worried and they saw that something was going on. So it was extremely ineffective, and that's an example of a maladaptive coping mechanism, which is very common with people that struggle severely with their mental health challenges. But back to the doctor's appointment, psychiatrist appointment, and being hospitalized, there was that behavior. It wasn't an active thing. It happened maybe every couple of months. But the lack of communication with an individual when I was scoring extremely highly on these tests for depression, I wasn't talking, I was lethargic, I was exhausted, I had lost weight, I had so much self-hatred, I had no desire to do anything, I was so hopeless, I was tearful all the time, I was constantly arguing with my parents. I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't really eating, I was sleeping too much during the day, I was leaving school early sometimes because it was just too much. All of these little things coupled together, and the lack of communication and understanding meant that I went into the hospital. And so I spent 7 or 10 days there, and it was really just about beginning that first treatment journey, lifting that initial depression so I could get an effective plan for what we were going to do next. I started medication, I started an intensive outpatient program, and there started to be a vocabulary for what I was experiencing. I was diagnosed with depression. I was having these medications that I was taking. I was going to do this outpatient therapy. I was working with my parents on addressing my emotions. And so there wasn't a lot of concrete things that happened during that hospital stay. It's kind of just a container to take you out of crisis in that short term. But I do remember that when I was about to be discharged that first time, I had this fixation on Hello Kitty coloring books. Every single day, all I did was color Hello Kitty. And it was the oddest thing. It's not something that I've continued to this day. But my parents and I would do these meetings with the social worker to figure out what my plan would be to go home. And they were like, how are you going to tell your parents if you're not okay? How are you going to tell them if you're having urges or if you're depressed? And I was like, I don't know. I don't want to. I just so struggled to be vulnerable in any aspect because I was so used to keeping it internal and shutting down. And they were like, okay, if anything happens, your code word is pineapple, and you're going to spend the full day with your parents, and if you feel anything and you need help, just say pineapple and they will get you support. And I barely even responded. I just kept turning the other way, coloring my Hello Kitty. And the psychiatrist and social worker were like, there's no reason to keep you here, but the emotional avoidance is so severe that if there was, we don't want to discharge you because there's just nothing is being addressed here. Nothing is being worked through. There's no shift that's happening. And so during the next year, I tried everything you can imagine on an outpatient basis. So I did CBT.
Sorry, I just want to pause you really quick because you said a lot there, and I think it's important for parents especially that are listening to this that we kind of go into this next question I want to ask you. So you mentioned you're in this rehabilitation facility, we'll call it, for people that are going through mental health crisis, right?
Yeah, the name was an adolescent psychiatric unit.
Right. Okay. And you're in there, and they're trying to help, get you medicated, to help get you kind of diagnosed, to see what exactly is kind of going on chemically with you. Also trying to talk to you more about what your coping skills are going to be like when you leave. But you were so shut down. You were saying you were just so avoidant in talking to people. Looking back now, is there anything that anybody could have said to you? Any questions your parents could have asked you in a different way that you think would have gotten you to open up on a deeper level? Or do you think at that point you just were just far gone, you didn't want to talk to anybody?
I mean, it's so hard because I think having the foundation of a relationship prior to mental health challenges is so important. Even the therapeutic relationship, when you start with a new therapist, and we'll touch on my experiences there, it takes a while to build that relationship, to feel the trust, and to feel comfortable going to them and saying, I don't think this is right. What's your advice here? What do you need me to do so I can feel better? What do I need to tell you? How can I get supported? And so that foundation really just wasn't there. And I felt so uncomfortable being vulnerable with my parents. I remember at times I'd be like, if I tell them anything, they'll just tell me I'm doing it wrong and give me advice that I don't want. And I just wanted to feel seen. And it's something my parents got really effective at, or they at least learn the skill set for during my time in intensive treatment, which is validation, which is that just saying like, I see you are in so much pain and I see you are struggling so much, and I might not exactly understand what you've been through. I haven't been through it myself, but I know you are in a lot of pain, and I just want you to know that I see that, and I want to help you, and I want to see you get better. And that's all that I really wanted. I wasn't able to verbalize it at that point, but all of these different ways that I was struggling at that point, it was self-harm, it was isolating further, it was wanting people to look in my head and be like, whoa, she really needs help, she's really sad, but not saying anything. It was shutting down and wishing people just would validate me and help that pain and suffering feel seen, feel heard, feel supported, feel loved.
Do you think that the fear of opening up to your parents that you had at one point had this solid relationship with, you talked about again, like that they were supportive of you during your childhood, do you think you felt like ashamed because you did have this good childhood, and then all of a sudden you're now having mental health issues, and you're in the back of your head, you're like, why am I having these? Like, my life is good at home. Like, were you afraid that your parents would kind of say something like that to you?
It was actually the opposite. I completely blamed them, and I was very vocal about that. I was like, you raised me. I didn't go through anything that would explain why I'm feeling this way. You did this. Like, what did you do wrong to make me experience all this pain and suffering? And I said that to them many times in a lot of very hurtful ways as I was lashing out. And through treatment and through learning about these things, we know that there's like the biological component, which for me was the emotional sensitivity, and then there's the environmental component. And my environment just caused me to feel chronically invalidated and misunderstood and unseen, regardless of their intentions. And I think having the skills to improve in that was a game changer for my family and I. But no, I didn't feel guilty or ashamed about what I was experiencing. If anything, it was just anger and blame and no accountability on my end, because I really hadn't articulated that we have to solve problems that we didn't create for ourselves. And so this depression, this anxiety wasn't something that I asked for or hoped for necessarily. I did make it a lot worse. I added a lot of fuel to the fire, but I didn't feel like I should have to pull myself out of rock bottom at 13 years old when I'm living in a mental hospital. I didn't think that was something that I should have to do, or any teen should have to do, and yet I had to do it. And so there wasn't a lot of guilt there. That was something that really added to it. It was just an extreme inability to feel my emotions, because when I did feel them, they were so painful. And thinking I would be invalidated, knowing there was a history of that, just made me want to do that even less because of how painful the emotions were that I was experiencing.
Right. Yeah, and the reason I bring that up is because I've heard a lot sometimes from kids when they grow up in like a really, really good household, when they start to experience depression or anxiety, or they have any kind of mental health issues that are impacting their life in a negative way, there's this sense of shame that's like, man, like my parents are together, they're not divorced, or I grew up in a, upper class neighborhood, or I went to a private school. Like, why am I feeling this way? Like, nobody else around me is feeling this way. Like, why am I going through this? And then that can lead to this fear and the avoidant behavior of opening up to your parents. All right, so let's continue on the journey. So you mentioned that biologically you noticed that as you grew up, you developed this emotional sensitivity. You just kind of weren't comfortable with who you were, and that really impacted your mental health in a negative way. So you get out of your first stay in the mental hospital. You talk about, you said you tried a concoction of things outpatient over that next year. What were they? What worked? What didn't work, if any?
I think that's a really real thing, especially if you have a strong relationship with your parents and you have a lot of love for them, a lot of compassion. You feel seen, you feel supported. And that's where I feel that our education system has failed us, and the way we talk about mental health is really lacking, because people should understand that regardless of your circumstances, you can still struggle. You can still feel hopeless and alone and isolated and unseen, even if you have people around you with the best of intentions and love and support. And it might be a biological thing, even though most of the time it's a mix of the two. It might be a skill set thing. Maybe you don't know how to structure your life with habits that allow you to have an effective experience. You don't know how to cope with the emotions that arise. You don't know how to feel seen in relationships through understanding your love languages and vulnerability and communication. Or maybe it's just needing to work through your belief systems and your inner monologue and how you see the world and view yourself. So I really do feel like if we continue to shift the way we're talking about mental health, that shame will kind of go away because people will understand that it's not a shortcoming of you. It's not something that you're doing wrong, and it's not a failure if you have a good childhood and you still struggle. And so I think we're moving in the right direction, but I do think that's something that adds to that shame that a lot of kids feel. And I think as a parent, just continuing to explain that to your kids as they get to middle school, teenage years, then they're mature enough to understand these things. Like explaining that sometimes you wake up feeling sad and having a bad day, and it doesn't have to do with the house you're living in or the coffee you have in the morning. All of these things are secondary and unrelated. And the same thing goes for depression and anxiety. So I think as a parent, there's a lot of things you can do there before your kid is struggling to explain that. And if they're ashamed to tell you, I would almost take it as a good sign because they love you, they care about you, and they don't want to like express the message like you're a bad parent or I don't feel like you're doing this right. Whereas me, I was the opposite. I was like, this is your fault. Your parenting is the worst. So I know it doesn't seem like a compliment, but it's a good thing. And there's some love hidden in there. On to your next point about outpatient. So from the time I was discharged from my first hospitalization, I went through about a year of outpatient treatment. So that was cognitive behavioral therapy, intensive outpatient programs, which was a mixture of psychotherapy, group therapy. We did like art therapy. We did so many different like versions of those. We did, what is that thing called? They do it with kids. It's not executive functioning. Trying to think of the word, but you do like arts and crafts in it.
I'm trying to I'm just drawing a blank too.
Occupational therapy. We did occupational therapy, all of the things that you can imagine.
And this was all for depression and anxiety. Like at this point, like there was nothing else that they had tried to diagnose you with? Okay.
Yeah, my primary diagnoses were always major depressive disorder and anxiety disorder. And the ways that those presented was still like self-harm. I started struggling with over-exercise and restricting my eating a lot. There was a lot of family conflict. My sleep was a mess. I was having all these nightmares and just like insomnia. I had a lot of panic attacks. I was diagnosed with panic disorder at one point. So all of these things were secondary to this primary depression and anxiety that I was experiencing. So I did the intensive outpatient program. From there, I did an outpatient dialectical behavioral therapy program, and we'll circle back to DBT because it came again later in my journey and was hugely effective, but I tried that on an outpatient basis, and I felt like things were kind of getting better. I was learning skills in DBT that allowed me to manage some emotions. In DBT, you do phone coaching, so if you are ever struggling, you can call your therapist and get support on what you're struggling with. So if you're struggling with self-harm, if you're having an argument with your parents, if you're just feeling really sad and isolated, you get coaching on how to navigate that situation. And so because I had that support in place, because I had an appointment I would go to every week and kind of just lay out all these annoyances I had with life and my parents and conflicts that were going on, I kind of did feel like things were getting better. But from a behavioral standpoint, from like a depression measurable standpoint, things weren't changing. And they were continuing along the same path. I was still engaging in self-harm. Following that first hospitalization, I started to become really suicidal, and the anxiety started to come out a lot more. And that meant that I would leave school early most days because I was having panic attacks, or I didn't feel like I could stay through the whole school day because I was just struggling so much. And so I did outpatient DBT. I was hospitalized 3 more times that year. After the fourth hospitalization, I did the same outpatient program again. So after school, you would go for 3 hours of intensive therapy. You did occupational, psychotherapy, family therapy, group therapy.
So like you're doing this all like while you're in school, like the outpatient stuff, like did the kids that you were in school with, did they like know that something was up with you, or was that kind of kept hush hush?
Yes and no. I was like a hot mess. Like I was sitting in classrooms scratching my arms off from panic attacks. I was leaving halfway through the day. Like part of it was very known that I was not doing so well. And the other part of it was my parents always encouraged me, or just made it clear to me that I didn't have to tell people. So even if I was gone for 10 days and in the hospital, I could come back and not tell anyone. I didn't owe anyone an explanation. And I think when you're struggling with anything, or you take a mental health day, or you take a leave of absence for mental health treatment, you think everyone is thinking about where you are. No one is thinking about where you are. Your close friends and family, they're concerned. No one is like, oh, she's probably in the hospital. Oh, she's probably getting mental health treatment. People are like, oh, she probably has a cold, or she's traveling. Now it's COVID. Like that should not be a concern that you are putting mental energy towards when you are struggling with these large, emotionally overwhelming things. But some people were aware. I became really and effectively codependent with a lot of my peers who then started struggling with depression and anxiety and suicidal ideation. And I really became a go-between, and like a treatment coordinator would be what I would almost describe it as for those kids, where they would be like, yeah, like I tried to kill myself last night, but no one knew. I was like, school counselor, can we get looped in here? Like, what are the next steps we're taking? Can we call the parents? Or I would be very aware that people were in the hospital, or that they were suicidal, or they had attempted to take their lives. And so I think to parents, that's one of the biggest pieces of counsel that I can give, is that it's just never effective for your teen's primary support system to be their friends when they're struggling in a big way with their mental health. I think having friends you can go to when you're having a bad day or when you are feeling off is huge. But if your kid is suicidal, if they're being hospitalized, they should not be going to their friends to navigate that, because that is just such an overwhelming burden to put on these other teens, and teens aren't equipped with the skills to navigate these things. So that was something that was also added to the picture. But yeah, some people were aware, some people weren't. I just was so, again, focused on what I was experiencing. But I think it was the general rumor mill or idea that, like, she's struggling. She's pretty depressed. Things aren't going too well.
Yeah, and the reason I wanted to ask is because I can imagine that it probably added another layer of shame, another layer of depression, stress, whether it was consciously or subconsciously, when you're kind of having to think about, like, what are these kids going to say about me when I come back to school? Like, do they know? And I'm sure it, like, kind of in many ways, it can make you behave in a certain way towards others if you're trying to become even more avoidant, because you have this thing that you're super nervous or ashamed of telling somebody that you kind of are keeping, like, close to your heart. You mentioned, the 3 more hospitalizations. Like, what made the 4th one, like, different? Like, what made that one the last one that you went to, and, like, what really shifted for you, like, during that time that helped you, like, really make a good, solid first step forward in your recovery?
So nothing actually shifted. I just ran out of options, and I was backed into a corner because I was in outpatient DBT at that time. It was the second time I was doing DBT, and they wouldn't take me back because I was a huge liability. I had tried to kill myself. I was in the hospital. I didn't call and ask for help when I was feeling suicidal. I didn't tell my therapist what was going on, and I had given it a good shot. And looking back, I was not an active participant in this. I didn't believe it would work. Again, I didn't believe that I would ever be happy. I didn't think I was deserving of being happy. So I was going through the motions. I was showing up for these appointments. I was putting out fires with self-harm and arguments with my parents and toxic relationships with the boyfriend that I was in at the time. But there was no real willingness to shift my belief systems, awareness of those belief systems. Again, there was still a lot of blame to my parents about what was going on. There was no accountability for the position that I was in. So while there were certain skills that were helpful, and maybe I felt a little bit less overwhelmed because I understood what was happening, things weren't changing. And so because I was a liability and outpatient wasn't working, it became really clear to my parents, and it was the official recommendation from my treatment providers, that I needed a higher level of care. And the hospital stays locally, like I mentioned, the 5150, the psychiatric unit. That's a short-term solution. There were kids that were there for a longer period of time, but that was more because they were waiting for their next treatment option, or they were waiting to be transferred, or those kinds of things. It wasn't because they were really doing intensive work or doing intensive treatment in that short-term hospital stay. Like, our day-to-day there was like, we ate our meals, we watched our movies, we did our coloring, we did our puzzles, we learned a CBT skill once a day, we did our outside time, we went to bed. Like, the therapeutic work wasn't happening. Yes, you were meeting with a psychiatrist for 10 minutes. There was no therapy going on. It was really like crisis management. We got to watch these kids because they're a risk to themselves or other people. So after my last hospitalization, I was still in that outpatient program, and my parents went back to the DBT program that I was in, and we're like, can she continue to work in DBT here? And the reason why they chose DBT initially is that it's an evidence-based treatment. It stands for dialectical behavioral therapy, for a variety of things. It was initially developed for adults that were severely suicidal and diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. The woman that developed it didn't specifically want to work with people that were struggling with borderline personality disorder. She describes it in her memoir because she also struggled, also was hospitalized, and then developed this treatment protocol. But she describes it as bringing people out of hell. And she describes it as helping people that are severely suicidal, severely overwhelmed, the chaos in their lives, the intensity of their emotions. And there aren't a lot of therapists that are willing to take on those patients who are highly suicidal, who are really unpredictable. And so that's why she created that treatment, because it was something that she wished she would have had, and she wanted to help other people that felt the same way she did. So dialectical behavioral therapy, originally shown for suicidal ideation and borderline personality disorder in adults, but since then there's been dozens of studies proving its effectiveness in adolescents and adults as well for things like just anxiety, just depression, eating disorders, OCD, and some components of that, but primarily like emotional suffering, difficulty regulating your emotions, tolerating distress, being interpersonally effective. That's what it works to improve. And so
what's the difference between like DBT and CBT? Because both of them, it's like blank behavioral therapy. Like what's so different about DBT that you think, like, why was it so much more effective for you than CBT? Like, what did it do specifically?
Yeah, no, I'll explain what makes it different, which is that CBT stands for cognitive behavioral therapy. And if you've ever seen the circle that says thoughts, behaviors, emotions, that is CBT. So you work to change your thoughts, which then change your behaviors, which then in turn change your emotions. And it can be effective. There are components of DBT that are super effective. DBT is now kind of branded as a branch of CBT, but it wasn't initially developed as that. DBT is really interesting that it's based off of this dialectic of acceptance and change. And so that's where the name is from, dialectical behavioral therapy. And so the acceptance of the circumstances that you are given, of the things that you can't control, of the suffering you're experiencing, and the willingness to change those and recognize, like, there's a good example, which is that you're doing your best and you can do better. And another example is like one person's truth can be true and the other person's truth can be true at the same time. There's so many examples of these dialectics in DBT. But when Marsha Linehan was developing it, she found that if she told patients that they really needed to just accept where they were at, they were like, you don't want to help me? Like, why aren't you helping me? You're my therapist. You're supposed to make things better. And if she was like, let's change this behavior, let's change what's going on, let's change this thought, they were like, you're saying this is my fault. You're saying that I'm feeling this way because I want to. But it was the perfect balance of both that allowed her patients to work towards change, but also feel seen and heard and supported and really effective in that path. And so DBT is heavily based on behavior. The bulk of it is the skills education that you do, and you learn how to tolerate distress, you learn how to regulate your emotions, you learn how to be mindful, you learn how to be interpersonally effective. And like I mentioned, maladaptive coping mechanisms are a huge thing, and so many people that struggle with their mental health get really far away from that baseline of effective functioning, and they get into these really maladaptive ways of expressing emotions and looking for validation. So DBT brings you back to that baseline of being effective. And most of the skills, if you are functioning well in your life, you're probably doing them. So it's things like staying on top of your emotional vulnerability. So getting enough sleep, exercising, eating well, taking your medication, avoiding mood altering substances if you're sensitive to that. It's things like advocating for an objective and an effective way, standing up for your self-respect in an interaction, distracting yourself when emotion is too intense, but then circling back later. But it really just lays it out in a very concrete way and gives the patient, the client, whatever you want to call it, a very specific and effective way to handle the emotions and crises that arise and get to the other side and see and feel a documented shift in their mood, their behaviors, their thoughts, etc. So
like when you started doing this for the second time, and it was like actually the time that you really took accountability and really put a lot of effort.
Yeah, so I was backed into this corner. I had no more options. My DBT program wouldn't take me back because I was such a liability, my parents started researching residential treatment programs, which is the step up from outpatient. And so they came across this program right outside of Boston at McLean Hospital. McLean is very infamous. It's the hospital from Girl Interrupted. Selena Gomez is a huge proponent of the DBT program at McLean. She's donated heavily there with Rare Beauty. There's a lot of celebrities, patients that have been there. When I Googled it, when I found out I was going to go there, I was like, previous asylum that Girl Interrupted was made about? What is happening? I was terrified. But it's a wonderful place. They are very evidence-based now. They are extremely effective. They do great work there. And the program that I went to is called 3 East. And it was a residential dialectical behavioral therapy program for adolescent girls. And the reason my parents chose it was because it was so evidence-based. The research showed that DBT works. They have a very high success rate. It's the best program in the country for DBT. It's a Harvard Medical School affiliated hospital. It's the #1 psychiatric hospital in the country. They're the best of the best when it comes to residential DBT. And so they chose that program because nothing was working. Like, I was doing Stanford DBT. I'd done it twice. I'd been hospitalized. Like, I was using a lot of pretty effective resources and things weren't shifting. So I was very lucky in the fact that my parents advocated for me and got me that level and caliber of treatment when I needed it. It's something that isn't possible for a lot of people. And on the other end of it, that's one of the reasons I started the podcast. But
And how old were you at this point?
This point, I was 14. So all of this hospital stuff really happened within a year and a half and escalated to the point of residential treatment. So my parents and I flew across the country. I packed my suitcase, got all my toiletries ready. I'm a big toiletry person. So I was like, I need all my shampoos. I need my lotions. I need my hair products for the mental hospital. Gotta be looking my best. And I flew across the country and my parents came with me. We got to Boston. I think we might have actually done some sightseeing things. We were like, let's walk around Boston, go to the Boston Common. The next day we showed up to the mental hospital, the giant brick building, and you do an intake meeting. And they ask you, the first thing they say is, do you want your parents in the room for this or do you want them to leave? And this intake meeting is with probably 12 or 13 clinicians. They're highly qualified, 3 psychiatrists, there's probably 5 or 6 therapists, there's social workers, there are the day-to-day people that you interact with, the skills educators. And they said, do you want your parents here or do you want them to leave? And I was like, I want them to leave. I immediately kicked them out. They just flown across the country, committed themselves and me to this highly effective residential treatment program, and I kicked them out of the room. And they asked me, do you think this will work? What are your thoughts on DBT? What are your thoughts on this opportunity, if you could call it such? And I said, it's not going to work. I've done DBT twice before. I've tried it. It doesn't work. I'm meant to be depressed. I'm meant to feel this way. I don't have the capacity to be happy and feel better in my life. And in the nicest way possible, they said, Sadie, here's the thing. You're the poster child for this program, and that everyone that comes in here is just as depressed as you are and just as anxious as you are, and we've helped hundreds of them. This will work if you can see the wisdom in it, if you can believe that we're going to help you and trust us enough to help you, and if you want to be here. All these other girls that you see walking around, there is probably 12, maybe 10 girls on the unit. All these other girls want to be here. They've chosen to be here. They've chosen to commit to themselves and give their all to this program. And if you don't want to do that, if you don't see the wisdom in it, that's okay. There's a lot of other programs out there that your parents can take you to, and they can sign on a dotted line, and you don't get to be an active participant in it. And that definitely scared me. I wanted to have some control over my mental health journey and my treatment. And so I was like, okay, I'll think about it. And the way that they explain the wisdom part of it, it's a thing in DBT where you have your emotion mind, your rational mind, and then the intersection of the two is your wise mind. So I had to be emotionally invested. I had to be vulnerable enough to trust these clinicians, this staff, this group of people to help me. I had to have some semblance of self-compassion to want to get better and believe that I deserved happiness. I had to have some kind of willingness to give this a shot. And then the rational part was that this is a highly evidence-based treatment. It's shown to decrease depression. It's shown to decrease anxiety, shown to decrease suicidal ideation. And it was going to make me feel better. But without being emotionally invested, that wasn't going to happen. And so that was the missing piece during that year of treatment prior, whether it was outpatient DBT, intensive hospital stays, outpatient programs. all of those things I wasn't an active participant in. So I was like, I'll think about it. I went to the hotel room, watched The Bachelor, ordered room service, came back the next morning, and then I started the next day. So I was at 3 East for a total of 14 weeks. It's a very intensive program. You're not only doing like literal like school, but you're learning the DBT skills all morning, every single day. But you're also doing family therapy once a week. Something that makes 3 East unique is that your parents are doing the same skills education once a week with all the other parents. So they're either Zooming in, or my parents would fly every other week. One of them would come one week, the other one would come the next to visit me, spend time together, and then also do the parent group and learn these skills that I was learning as well, so they could learn how to validate and support me and advocate for an objective when they needed to, or express how they were feeling, or take a moment away from an argument if it got too intense. So they learned the same skills. In addition, I was doing individual therapy with a therapist, and I was doing therapy up to like 5 times a week sometimes. And I was also doing group therapy every day. We did like psychoeducation groups. We could learn from the psychiatrist like what we were feeling and why we had intense emotions, and the like brain part of depression and medications and why you take medications. We did animal therapy, we did music therapy, we did mindfulness groups, pretty much anything and everything that you can imagine. We didn't do like equine therapy, like there were some boundaries, but we did a lot of different types of group therapy. In addition, we did vulnerability groups, so many different things. And then on the weekends, you would kind of practice the skills. You would go out to dinner, we'd do ice cream nights, we'd go to the movies. And especially for people that struggled with avoidance or anxiety, that was a really effective way to practice these skills, practice coping with anxiety, being out in public, doing normal activities that you would be doing once you went home. So during those 14 weeks, we got really clear on the diagnosis stuff that was going on. So there was that depression. I was diagnosed with OCD while I was there. I got a lot of clarity on like the eating disorder behavior front and got a really effective plan for navigating that and handling that. And then relating to the depression and suicidality, while I was there, I made the decision to take suicidal ideation off the table as an option. And I think this is a really interesting thing that we don't always think about when we think about suicidal ideation and people that contemplate suicide. And the reason why I think it's so hard to stop engaging in suicidal thoughts and suicidal ideation is that it's not only like a dark, scary, intrusive thought that comes into your mind associated with depression, but it's like an outlet, it's an emotional regulation mechanism, it's a coping skill, and it's something you're using to regulate yourself. So if you have a bad day, if you're feeling really depressed, you are almost like, yeah, this is bad, but if it's really bad, there's this option that will make me feel better. So it's a safety blanket. It's something that I was using when I was experiencing all this pain to say, you know what, I'm not stuck in this forever. Like if it gets any worse, there's this option. So it's a very hard thing to heal from suicidal ideation, to take that off the table, to work through those thoughts, because it is so strongly intertwined with your ability to regulate your emotions and regulate those difficult moments that arise. And so that was one shift that took place while I was there. I got a lot more effective with my daily functioning. So getting my sleep under control was a huge thing because I was a very big insomniac. I would also sleep all day to avoid things. I was exhausted. I liked to nap a lot. I would isolate in that way. So I had an intervention at one point where when I wasn't in my room, my door would be locked. I couldn't go into my bed and nap. And at one point, I didn't tell anyone I was going to nap. I wasn't intentionally like hiding to take my nap, but I just forgot to be like, okay, I'm going into my room now after a therapy session. So I like took my 2-hour nap and someone opens the door. They would do room checks every hour or so just to make sure everything was okay. And they were like, Sadie, you're in here? And I was like, yeah, what's going on? And if they don't have eyes on you every 15 minutes, it's an issue. If they don't actually see you for more than an hour, you have to get a medical clearance. So I had to go to the emergency room and like get all of these tests done to make sure I didn't like eat a book or something. And so that was a fun moment because they have all those policies and things in place for liability reasons. But yeah, sleep was a big thing, getting that in control and getting to a point where I felt rested enough overnight that I could wake up in the morning and go to group therapy, go to the partial hospitalization program, which I did at one point, which it's pretty much the same thing. You learn the skills, but I would go to different buildings. So it was like I was going to school and then I would come home to the unit at the end of the day. And I also worked through these belief systems that I had. I articulated that I didn't feel worthy of love or deserving of love, or that I would ever feel better. And I started to tell my parents that I didn't ever think I would be good enough for them. And that was something that was really scary. I started to express my emotions to them as they arose. I started to tell them when I needed support with feeling depressed, feeling anxious. We worked through a lot of conflict that had come up during the time that I was struggling. And then
were your parents like scared like during this time, like when you were at McLean, or were they kind of in a place where they're just like, it was like survival, where they were going to do whatever they could to help you get better?
There was a lot of emotions, my mom especially, and I think at McLean, once I was able to explain to my dad how much I really was struggling, I think that brought up some emotion as well for him, because I don't think he just truly articulated or understood how much I was suffering and how much I didn't want to be on this planet. And I don't think he even realized that kids, 13-year-olds, could feel that way. I had a lot of trust in the team at 3 East and knew that I was getting the best support. It's very scary to have a child who's suicidal. Like, I slept on their bedroom floor on a blow-up mattress for 6 months because they didn't trust me to sleep in my room alone. My mom was taking me to these therapy appointments 5 days a week. They were, again, flying from California to Boston every weekend to be part of these therapy groups. So they were highly motivated to help me feel better. They wanted me to feel better. And of course, there were times that they were fearful when I was suicidal or I did attempt to take my life. But at that point, I do feel that they had a lot of trust in the team at 3 East. And as we started to see progress, that was very encouraging.
All right, so you're now like communicating with your parents at McLean. You're starting to open up and express yourself, for the first time in an authentic way about how you're feeling, some of these negative beliefs that you have about yourself, and maybe even towards your relationship with them. What were those initial conversations like with your parents? And then like, where did that lead you?
So they were rough. Just like we had code word pineapple, one of my therapy assignments was called the Tourette's game, which isn't the best, most effectively named thing. But what I would do is, my therapist explained, she was like, anytime you have an emotion, whether it's happy, sad, anxious, scared, depressed, lonely, once per dinner or once per meal, when I was spending time with my parents, I just had to blurt out the emotion that I was feeling, because it was so difficult for me to even articulate, pause the conversation and be like, I feel sad today, or I'm having this intrusive thought, or I'm really anxious about this thing for not a really good reason. So that was how that communication started, was once a dinner, I'd be like, sad. And they'd pretend like it wouldn't happen, and we'd continue on with our conversation, because that was how uncomfortable that vulnerability was. And that was the response that I could kind of tolerate from them. And then I began to articulate more like, I really don't feel like I am ever going to be good enough for you guys. And I don't think I deserve to be loved, or that I'm not lovable. And that's why I think I'm so depressed. And that came with time, that came with practice, that came with exposure therapy to feeling those vulnerable feelings. But the starting place was those blurting out emotions, and then just continuing on as if nothing had happened. And then by the end of my time at McLean, I felt really confident in my ability to go to them if I needed help. And that became really clear during my time at the therapeutic boarding school after that, because I would get on the phone with them and I would just cry. We'll get into why, that was just such a crazy experience, but I was able to actually express an emotion and be like, I really miss you guys and I love you guys. Whereas I didn't say I love you to my parents for years, because I had all this resentment and fear that I wasn't good enough for them. So I pushed them away. And so there was a lot of growth that took place there. So there was a lot of schedule stuff, there was medication management, there was skills education, and then there was just time of maintaining this progress, continuing to let the depression seep away day by day as I compiled this mastery of being able to cope with these things, practicing visiting home. I would fly home and visit my family and then come back to the unit and spend time with them and sit in the discomfort of those interactions and those environments and still be able to cope with it effectively. So it's 14 weeks at McLean. I left, and the recommendation was to go to a therapeutic boarding school, because again, the home environment that I was in, I experienced so much invalidation there. There was so much ineffective coping that went on there. The school that I was at didn't feel like a great fit. I didn't have a lot of friends because I'd pushed them all away at that point. So the recommendation was to go to a second program for a longer period of time, because in order to go to McLean, I took a medical leave of absence for my freshman year of high school. So the second semester, I wasn't in school. And originally, I thought I was only going to be gone for 6 weeks. That's the estimated stay for girls at 3E is just 4 to 6 weeks. So I was like, okay, 6 weeks, I'll make up my schoolwork when I come back. It'll all be normal. That was not the case at all. I was there until February to June, and then I went to a therapeutic boarding school. So the therapeutic boarding school allowed me to continue to stay on track with my academics, to make up the classes that I had missed second semester of freshman year so that I could graduate on time, and also keep doing therapy, continue to maintain that progress. And I don't know of any therapeutic boarding schools that are evidence-based and effective and research founded like McLean is. The one that I went to was a very small school in Montana. There were 40 girls there, and there were no psychologists on staff. It wasn't super effective, but I had these amazing skills that I was equipped with. And so I had an ability to ask my parents for help when I needed it, continue to build that relationship, to tolerate the distress that I was experiencing, to continue to regulate my emotions. I was so motivated to continue to keep suicide off the table as an option because I had so much hope for what my life could look like. Prior to that, I was like working towards this idea of being happy. But if you can't remember being happy, which is something that a lot of people that are depressed experienced, working towards that goal of feeling better is really abstract and unknown, because it's not like you're like, oh, I'm going to get to this goal of, I don't know, if you're losing weight, you're like, my goal weight is this, I just have to lose this many pounds to get there. This idea of being happy is something that isn't as defined. And the way the DBT problem solves that is this thing called a life worth living. And when you start DBT, they ask you, what's your life worth living? And you get really clear on like what your relationships look like, what they feel like, how you regulate your emotions, what projects you engage in, what activities you utilize, how you feel, how you advocate for yourself, all of these little things that are important to have effective mental health. And you work towards that. You work towards your life worth living. That's that goal that's on the horizon. And so that's a lot more effective and motivating than just being like, I'm working towards being happy, which is really difficult to do. Yeah, at the therapeutic boarding school, I was still really motivated. I still really wanted to get to that point. I was so encouraged by the progress I had made that I felt that I could continue to go home. I really wanted to go home and live back at home, live with my parents, live with my family, go back to high school and have a normal rest of high school. And so I spent 14 months at the therapeutic boarding school in Montana. I finished up my sophomore year there and left right before my junior year. And I started the podcast while I was there that second summer, and continued to maintain the progress that I had regardless of less therapeutic breakthroughs and drastic change, but that stability was consistent. And on the tail end of that 14 months, my parents felt really confident in my ability to regulate my emotions, to take ownership of my mental health. They felt okay with me coming home and not being worried that I would relapse or not be okay, and I felt really confident in my ability to do that as well.
That's amazing, and good for you for not only just like kind of recognizing like all this stuff at such a young age, but pulling yourself out in the way that you have, because there's a lot of people that just don't. There's a lot of people that just continue to struggle and struggle and struggle, and sometimes to no fault of their own, depending on their environment, right? And a lot of others turn to drugs and alcohol to kind of self-soothe, and it becomes this repetitive pattern that goes on and on and on, and sometimes they never escape or get out of it. And it seems like this therapeutic boarding school, while there wasn't, like you said, it wasn't maybe as effective as you thought it may have been, it was like the ultimate bridge for you to kind of step down from McLean, where you're in a place that's hyper medically supervised with some of the best, to now you're in a place that's still supervised and you're in a controlled environment, but it's not perfect and it's not the way maybe you thought it would, which is, it's life, right? That's like life isn't perfect. There's going to be hiccups. There's going to be things that are unexpected. There's going to be a lot of uncertainty. It's going to be a lot of discomfort, which you said you now had the skills to kind of manage all that and communicate effectively with your parents. And then that inspired you to start your podcast and doing what you're doing now. And so there's been obviously a few years since the time you left the therapeutic boarding school to now? I know you're in school and college now.
Almost to the day I would have left McLean. I think it was July 12th. I started at the therapeutic boarding school. So 4 years ago to the date.
Wow, it's insane. It's crazy. Like what a story. So there's been a lot of time between then and now. Like if you can, like walk me and the audience through like what those initial few months were like back at home on your own. Like what were some of the growing pains you experienced? How did you get through them? Like what were those first few months like?
Yeah, I loved what you said about the bridge because that's so true. I had the best intentions. Like, I wanted to go home after McLean. I begged my clinicians. I was like, please let me go home. I don't want to go to another program. I remember saying, and I found this in my treatment, like the notes that they write up, like the medical report. They're like, patient expresses desire or expresses the belief that she is done with treatment. She is done with investing in her mental health. She has completed that part of her life. Little did I know. But yeah, I do think that it wouldn't have been as smooth of a transition if I went home after McLean. I think it would have been a lot easier to relapse, to go right back into that environment that I had just created all these shifts after leaving. So a bridge was helpful and is helpful, and I think that can be replicated both as an adult and for teens as well. But leaving the therapeutic boarding school, I was in a really unique position because I had this wealth of knowledge and mental health experiences from the year and a half, 2 years prior. Like I'd been hospitalized, I lived in a mental hospital, I did all of this treatment, I'd done so much therapy, but my mental health was normal. Like I didn't wake up depressed, I was able to stay on top of classes, I was motivated. And so when I enrolled in our local public high school, started my junior year of high school, I made friends with that similar energy. I was just a normal kid. And yes, I did have this podcast that I was doing and I had some interesting, unique experiences. That wasn't what I led with because I was no longer just, hi, I'm Sadie, I'm depressed. It was, hi, I'm Sadie, like I like snowboarding, and what else were my interests at the time? I was like, I want to be a pediatric surgeon. I volunteer at the hospital. That was what I was leading with. And my mental health was no longer the thing that was consuming all my time and attention and thoughts. So it was a really normal experience, and that I would like go to my classes. I was starting to think about what I wanted to do for college. I was studying for the SATs. More therapeutically, that transition. I still do therapy once a week. That's something that I have done since I left the therapeutic boarding school. I still take the same medication that I started when I was at McLean. I'm going to do those checkups every couple of months. I continue to maintain the relationships that I built both in treatment, like with my family, and also since treatment with my friends that allow me to feel seen and supported and loved and not isolated and all of those other messy emotions that I previously encountered in relationships. I'm really big on structure and routine. That routine was what changed everything for me at McLean. So making sure that my sleep is always on track is one of my biggest goals, and something that I immediately notice if it's wrong. We're traveling and I was so jet lagged and we weren't sleeping well every night, and I was so irritable. My family was like, you are terrible to be around, Sadie. And I was like, I know, I'm just really tired, guys. And so it's something that I notice I'm really sensitive to, and it's really important to my mood, and everyone's different with how much that affects them. But like for me, I know that's like a huge emotional vulnerability. So it's that awareness that I problem solve for that. I'm also I go back to those same basics with like my eating plan from McLean of like, what meals do I like that I have nutrients that I can eat 3 times a day, and also snacks. There's not binging or restricting or guilt or these other emotions. Exercising and getting outside as much as I can, walking, being really conscious of what makes me feel better versus making me feel worse, and that awareness. So many things like that. I'm a really big proponent now, since I've started the podcast, of being a critical consumer on TikTok and social media, with only really interacting and engaging with content that makes you feel good. So my Explore page, unlike probably most teenagers, is puppies and nail videos, because that makes me really happy. And the TV shows that I watch are things that make me laugh and that I enjoy. And so all of these little things are intended to help me build my life worth living and live that life worth living.
So with that, I want to kind of ask you something in response to what you just said, like that you kind of surround yourself with things that make you feel good online. You watch things that make you feel good online. I think there's so much importance to that But then where do you draw the line with also like giving yourself some exposure therapy to maybe engaging in like tough conversations with somebody maybe you might not agree with, or maybe like do you do some inner work when you see something that triggers you online? Like how do you like, where's your boundary with that?
I mean, I'm not perfect. Like, if I'm having a bad mental health day, I will avoid things that will bring up more negative emotions. I think the difficult conversations, like, I'm not going to go on, like, in Facebook comments in some random Facebook group and, like, start a conversation with someone with different political views with me. It's more like things that come up organically in real life with like my friends or with my parents or my siblings, where I'm like, whoa, I don't believe that. Like, what are you talking about? That's wrong. And they're like, no, you're wrong. And so that's something that organically happens in all relationships. I think just being on social media, it's something that I try and have that outlook, and it's not perfect. Like, I like to listen to podcasts that have different perspectives. I'm studying psychology. I'm taking so many different classes at Penn to fill my requirements about so many different things, whether it's like calculus, which I'm not a fan of, or philosophy classes and learning people's perspectives. So all of those things are there in the grand scheme of things, and part of getting an education and creating content for something like a podcast, which makes you have so many conversations with so many different people in a really deep way, and learn about their upbringings and their childhoods and their belief systems. And that constantly pushes my understanding of things and my beliefs. And then just like from a day-to-day though, when it's like things there that I can control or things that I'm like, let's not make this harder on myself, that's kind of where I'll be like, I'll choose to look at puppy videos and nail TikToks rather than like people getting really intense about political views, and I'm like, that's just gonna make me angry. So it's like little tweaks like that. But in the broader view of things, as we function through life, especially today, those conversations and pushing the boundaries of your knowledge are just, I think, part of our functioning. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just wanted to kind of touch on that because I think that's one of the big mistakes that a lot of people can make. And I guess it's with good intentions, is trying to almost like shield yourself from the reality of the world that we exist in sometimes, and just knowing that just because maybe somebody like disagrees with you on something, or you believe something different, or maybe that doesn't make you happy, doesn't mean that they're necessarily like dangerous. It just means that you just aren't aligned with them maybe on your values, or doesn't interest you. But I still think it's important to kind of challenge yourself and also do some work and being like, all right, like if somebody posts that and that triggers me, like why? Like, what is it about me or my past or something? Like, what is this bringing up? And so I'm glad you touched on that, and then the importance of also like having these conversations with your friends and family as they come up. So you talked about like your relationship with social media. You've talked about how you've continued on with the therapeutic recommendations from McLean and nutrition and your sleep and stuff like that. I mean, you just mentioned that you're at Penn, which is what, Ivy League school, right? It's not an easy school to get into. Like, was it smooth sailing after you had acquired all these skills? You said you had this new mindset when you came back home to then transition into going to school at Penn, or were there some hiccups along the way?
I mean, the first hiccup, like 4 or 5 months out of treatment, was COVID. We learned we were going to go into lockdown, and I was like, from a mental health perspective, this is a disaster. Like, I'm not having this structure. I'm not having my schedule. I'm trying to make new friends at this new school. I'm trying to understand where my academic passions lie so I can apply to colleges. And I was like, I can't stay inside all the time with my family. This is going to be so bad. But then I was like, you know what, Sadie? You've lived in a mental hospital for months. If anyone is equipped to navigate this, it's you. And so it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be, as most things are in life. And so that was one of the first things that I was like, this is a challenge. This is going to test my skills and my ability to function. But for the most part, I just kind of kept chugging along. We all have our moments. We all have our bad days. There have been conflicts that have come up, or like belief systems or situations that I have to grapple with and work through. But there was no relapse. There was no giant mental health crises that I went through that put me back to where I was. When I was in treatment, there wasn't a lot of teenagers that were fully recovered that were saying this is possible, and it's possible because I've done it myself. So many adults said that to me, but that's hard to resonate with because it's like, well, you have so much autonomy over your life and things are just different as an adult. You don't get it, like that typical teenage angst. So I wanted to be that voice of a teenager who had fully recovered and wanted to show that it was possible. I also, like we highlighted, was so lucky in terms of the resources I had access to the clinicians that I worked with, the skills that I learned. And so I wanted to share that with a larger audience. And I also knew that a lot of those skills could have been effective to know earlier on, like how to regulate anger versus sadness versus fear, how to go towards anxiety like you were talking about rather than avoid it like the plague, because that makes it worse, how to be vulnerable in your relationships, that you could feel seen rather than being like, no one gets me, but you're not actually saying anything or expressing your emotions that you want validated. But I really didn't think I would ever do anything in the mental health field professionally because I thought that it would trigger me, and that I was like, being around that depression, and anxiety and struggle, I was like, there's no way that wouldn't make me relapse. And I realized that I was having these conversations, I was continuing to share the wisdom that I had from treatment and relive those experiences, and I was doing it and I was okay. Like, I wasn't relapsing, I wasn't going back to those original headspaces and emotions and beliefs. And that's when I realized, okay, this is what I really want to do. The other thing that happened was I took AP chemistry, and I was like, the medical route is not for me. This is way too hard. This does not come naturally. I'm more of like a creative, artistic psychology kind of gal. So when it came time to apply to college, the podcast was my thing. I talked about it in all of my essays. It was something that was so important to me and that I had so much pride about, because I took this pain and suffering and the way that my parents would describe like how I should talk about it in my college application, because we still have a lot of stigma in our society. I think if you go into a college application and it's like, hi, I'm a suicidal teenager that's been hospitalized 4 times, most colleges probably would see that as a liability. And so I really wanted to paint this picture of like a phoenix rising from the ashes moment of, I had the struggle, I had the suffering, I worked through it, and I made something from it. And so my why Penn essay was because Penn is at the forefront of psychological research. They allow their undergraduates to be really involved in research, whereas other schools, sometimes you have to be more at a graduate level to be as hands-on. My personal essay, tell me about yourself, whatever, the question was about the podcast and about my mental health journey. And the other one, the community aspect, was I think that I can bring a lot to Penn by facilitating these mental health conversations and also bringing the knowledge of the psychology professors to a larger audience and share that wisdom that they're sharing. So it tied up nicely in a great bow. Didn't think I was going to get in. My scores were in the range. I felt so proud of this essay and essays that I'd written in the the application I was submitting with the clubs I'd been a part of. And I was really proud of what I was submitting for someone who, again, took a semester off of school for mental health and was in treatment for a year and a half, and all of these things I went through. I was really proud. Didn't think I was going to get in, didn't think there was a chance. I was so shocked when I did get in, and yeah, it went well from there. I finished up my senior year. Senioritis came in hard. I went 150% with the podcast. Not as much focusing on the academics that I should have. That is one regret that I did have senior year. So parents, if you have kids going into their senior year, encourage them to finish strong. But yeah, I started at Penn, and I have continued to do the podcast and really just have allowed it to continue to grow and evolve, and I'm really happy with where it's at now. It really does feel like the resource that I wish I had when I was struggling, because there are so many conversations that cover every aspect of mental health and offer so many valuable personal experiences and tangible skills and expert opinions. And yeah, I'm very, very proud of it, and I'm continuing to understand more and more about mental health now from the academic side rather than from the patient side, which is a kind of fun thing to do. But I take all my psychology classes. I'm continuing to pursue that. I'm going into my sophomore year this year. So yeah, it's something that I really love, and I really do feel like I ended up at the right spot. And I've been able to carry all of those mental health skills to college and through that transition. And those skills, those routines, that sleep schedule, the podcast that I have so much passion and pride for, those things have allowed me to maintain my mental health throughout that transition and throughout that shift of relationships and schedule and location. And so all of it fits together very well, which didn't seem like was going to at the beginning, but everything happens for a reason. And I think that was very, very true in my story.
Amazing. Like, what a story, Sadie. And again, congrats to you for everything that you've accomplished at such a young age and really been able to bounce back and recover from such a traumatic childhood that you endured. 2 more questions, and they're going to be kind of quick. I think that success in many ways leaves clues. And just looking back at your journey, at your recovery process, what would you say if you had to pinpoint 1 or 2 things that were the deciding factors and really helping you recover, that you've been able to carry like these skills with you from the time that you learned them, other than DPT? Like, what were they? I mean, for instance, like, was it the fact that your family was so heavily involved in treatment and recovery? Like, was it the exposure therapy? Like, if you could pinpoint like one or two things, what would they have been?
Yeah, I think one was that moment at McLean where they said you have to see the wisdom in this, which is that I had to have enough self-compassion to want to get better. I had to trust people to help me, and I had to see the potential of recovery, and I had to believe that. I had to be an active participant in this, and I think any goal that you're pursuing, if you don't believe it's possible, if you don't believe the outcome is in some probability capable of occurring, it's just not going to happen. Like, whether you believe manifesting, whether you just think about the way that you interact with the world, if you're like, this isn't going to work. I think that was one of the biggest things, that shift of trying to cultivate enough self-compassion to want to get better and to want something better for myself and to trust others to help me get to that point. That was a huge shift. And in any mental health journey, I think that's a common thread, that whether you're choosing recovery, whether you're choosing to change your behaviors, whether you're choosing to be vulnerable, it's that choice. You always have the option to make things worse, and you have the option to make things better, and you have to be an active participant. None of these things happen to us. We are making these decisions. We are causing them to be better or worse. I'm a huge believer in cause and effect, especially in mental health, and so that choice was a huge thing. The second one, I would say, is consistency. All these things take time. I remember at McLean, I felt so supported. I did feel like things had to be getting better because, again, I was doing so much. But I remember just waking up one day, and instead of immediately feeling suicidally depressed, I just felt neutral. And I was like, whoa, what is this feeling? I haven't felt this way in years. And that was a result of the consistency of doing the therapy, doing the work, having the tough conversations, learning the skills, implementing the skills. And even though I was having those small, happier moments throughout those days, you don't always notice how far you've come. And I think it's really easy to get caught up in the right now. And even now, like when I have a down day, I'm like, oh, this is terrible. And I'm like, okay, but what was my down day 4 years ago? I was suicidally depressed and being put in an ambulance to go to the hospital. And so there's a lot of perspective that can be provided by looking back in regards to consistency, but none of these changes would have been long lasting if there wasn't consistency and using the skills and continuing to do the work and asking for help and being willing to work on my mental health.
Yeah. Consistency is so important, and embracing the journey. And you kind of pointed to a quote that I often have say to myself and others, and that's focus on how far you've come and not how far you have to go. I think that's something that if people can embrace and just really celebrating the things that you have accomplished, how far you have come in your own journey, versus looking at everything that you haven't done yet, I believe that your mindset will shift for the better. Last question I have, and this is going to be kind of rapid fire. There's a lot of parents that maybe can't afford to send their kids away to a top tier place like McLean or to a therapeutic boarding school afterwards for over a year, and they're just trying to figure it out with the money that they do have, and just trying to help their kid who's struggling with their mental health. If you maybe had like 30 seconds with a mom or a dad in a coffee shop, and they were like, Sadie, like, what are 3 like must-dos with my kid who's struggling? And what are 3 like don't do's with a teenager who's really struggling with their mental health? Like, what would you say to them?
I mean, to the expense piece, I didn't mention this, but when I was really in the thick of it, that 8th grade year, coming in and out of the hospital, the biggest support and constant and love that I felt was from my school counselor. She might have actually been the assistant principal, but she was a counselor at one point. She was my 7th grade humanities teacher, and I would just sit in her office for hours. She came and visited me in the hospital. I would just talk to her. She was there, and she supported me, and that wasn't a therapist. She wasn't a clinician that I'd gone to. She wasn't part of any of these programs. She was just an adult that was there to support me and accept me as I was, and she would like give me her Netflix password and recommend shows that she thought I would like, or we would draw, or she would give me projects of like lettering that I could do, like these really small organic things that allowed me to feel loved, seen, and supported at no price tag. And so I think having that some person in a child's life that can be there in that capacity is huge. I think for parents, validation is the biggest thing. It did take my parents and I 14 weeks at McLean on the other side of the country to really even get the skill set for that, let alone master it. But just saying to your kid, like, I see your pain, I see you're struggling, and not giving advice, just creating space for those emotions is huge. That's all I ever wanted from my parents, was to feel seen and loved and accepted as I was. Right along with that validation is just telling your kid that you love them no matter what, for who they are, regardless of their accomplishments or their mental health or how they're showing up or how they're feeling today or how they're expressing their emotions, that love is universal. And my parents now, it's something that they say all the time because they learned that that's something that's not like a given for me. It felt like I had to earn that love. And so telling your kid, just like, I love you no matter what, like being really clear that love is there regardless of anything else that's happening. And I think the third thing we touched on is just like the education and the way that we talk about mental health. Set your relationship up to support your kid when they're struggling. So if they come to you with like a small emotion, like I'm feeling stressed about this test, handle it like you'd want to handle their mental health crisis. So like, don't be like, okay, well, when I was your age, I would study for 6 hours a night. And the kid was like, I just wanted to complain. I just wanted to say this is hard and I don't really want to deal with it right now. Like, really create the space for them to feel safe and comfortable and supported when they come to you with an emotion. And at least for my parents, I felt that the instinct is always advice. And I feel like kids appreciate not the advice, but just the support. So if you find yourself really going to that advice, maybe try the support for a while and see how they respond to that. But yeah, I think setting your relationship up, setting that foundation so that when they are struggling, if they are struggling, they feel supported and safe in coming to you to express that. There's so many things. The way that my dad would try to get me out of bed when I was struggling with depression, sleeping on their floor in a blow-up bed, is he would play orchestra music as loud as the speaker would go. They would get up to go for the day. I was like, roll over. I'm like, not happening today. We'll try again tomorrow. And he would be like, play orchestra music volume 10. And then he would get on the floor and be like, Sadie, going to school today is so important. If you don't go to school today, you are not going to be able to stay on top of your academics. You're not going to get into a college. You're not going to be able to get a job. You're not going to be able to have a life. The catastrophizing, the kids probably already doing that in their head. This moment really, really 50 years down the line is not going to matter. Don't say that to them. And I think asking for help is another huge thing. Like, no parent is really equipped to support their child through these mental health challenges. Like, that shouldn't be expected of you. Like, I think of these parenting books that people read when they're pregnant about like swaddling and breastfeeding and all of these tips that are swirling around. Like, just wait till you get to teenage years. There's even less information. Like, if you need therapy, where do you even go? So ask for help. Ask a school counselor. Ask your pediatrician. Get a therapist yourself if you need it, because you shouldn't know how to do this, and that's okay. That's why there are these resources out there. It's totally okay to ask for help. More things to not do, like the invalidation. Like, why are you upset about that? Like, no, that's not right, or you shouldn't feel that way. The minimizing, like, it'll be okay, it's fine, it's not a big deal. That's a tough thing to hear for kids that experience their emotions very intensely.
Well, I think you already kind of covered it. You just said like don't like really shame them or catastrophize things. Like, they're like, chances are the kids are already doing that themselves. You know, make sure that you don't try to do it yourself. Like, try to seek out like a support system, whether
there are answers there. Like, you don't need to think that you should have them. My parents definitely did not have them, and that's why we got so many clinicians and therapists looped in, because we didn't know what to do. But yeah, there are so many things, but I think like the baseline is be a validating, supporting person for them to go to, and trust that your relationship is good enough that they want to come to you for support, and just let them. And that's all that kids really want.
Sadie Sutton, what a story, and thank you so much for sharing it on here, as well as all the insights, the wisdom, and tips for parents, for kids, for anybody who's listening to this that knows somebody, which I'm sure based on statistics you do, that is struggling with their mental health. So I'm sure people are going to want to connect with you. Parents, or if they're listening, they're going to want to check out your podcast to like learn more about you and maybe some of the guests that you've interviewed about their mental health. So where's the best place for them to find you and your podcast and social media and things like that?
Yeah, so you can listen to She Persisted wherever you get your podcasts. My website is shepersistedpodcast.com. Everything is there, as well as information about resources and DBT. And then I'm most active on Instagram and TikTok at @shepersistedpodcast.
Sweet. Well, I'll make sure to plug that stuff in the show notes. And for those that are listening, what I invite you to do is to share a takeaway. Maybe it was something that Sadie said about her childhood that resonated with you, whether you're a parent that maybe can relate to how Sadie was raised, or maybe you know somebody that was raised like that, or maybe it was something that Sadie said about her experience when she first started to understand that her mental health was off. Maybe it was something she said about her experience in the mental health hospitals or McLean, or even like afterwards, how she got into recovery from depression and anxiety and really started to thrive. And something that she said along those lines really resonated. Whatever it was, make sure to tag Sadie and tag myself, because we'd love to hear your feedback. And we once again thank you for listening to this episode of The Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst. We'll see you next time.